Good morning. We are learning Leila Nishmas Mintal Mariam Vaskam and Ruven and Neshama Shem and Aliyah. We are on the bottom of Ayin Aleph Amud Beis by the two dots, all the way at the bottom of Ayin Aleph of 71b. And we are now going to talk about a different type of carbon. Yesterday we were talking about a carbon chatas. Today we're going to talk about a carbon asham. Asham is another type of offering that's brought for certain sins, very specific ones. One of them is me'ilah. If a person, there's objects which are designated for the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan, and a person goes ahead and uses them, that is called me'ilah. In other words, they belong to the Beis HaMikdash, and I go ahead and this thing which is designated for usage in the Beis HaMikdash, I go ahead and I use for my own personal use. I have to go ahead and in addition to paying back for the loss of value of that item, I have to bring a carbon asham. That's one case. Another case is if I steal something and then I lie about it in court, in addition to paying back the money, I'd have to go ahead and bring this carbon. Another one is a scenario called asham shivcha charufa, which we're going to talk about. It's a scenario where a slave woman, someone who is a non-Jewish slave, has like a quasi status of a Jew, and they are engaged to a Jew. They're not typically allowed to marry a Jew. What they're able to marry is a Jewish servant, someone who is sold into slavery. They are allowed to be connected to them. It's not a full-fledged marriage, and if someone goes ahead and cohabits with this shivcha, with this maidservant, with this slave woman, then they have to bring a carbon asham. Those are three different cases where a person would have to bring so. And typically we have something called a carbon asham, and then there's something asham vadai, which is I know I definitely sinned, and then there's an asham talui, which means I bring this offering. There's these types of things. I bring this offering in a scenario where I'm not sure if I sinned. Okay, so typically, let's say for a chatas, if on Shabbos I wasn't sure if I sinned, I don't bring a carbon, right? It's only when I know that I made the mistake. But with the asham, we have something called the asham tali. If I'm not sure that I sinned, I still bring a carbon. Okay. That's the introduction. Okay. So, Amar Ula, one more important piece, sorry. And that is a machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and Rav Tarfon in Maseches Krisos about a person who did not know the following case. The case is like this: a person goes ahead and commits a crime which would obligate an asham, and the person does not know if they did it or not. So what do they bring? They bring an asham talui. A talui means like it's dependent, like it's not a certain case of asham. So a guy goes ahead and commits a crime that would be obligated an asham, but he's not sure if he did it. So he brings a karban asham talui, and then finds out that he did indeed do the crime. Okay, so does he have to now bring another carbon or not? Yes, no? Okay, I don't know. How would we know? What's it called? Okay, so Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, he would have to because there was no yediyah, right? We saw this idea. I have to have knowledge that I did a crime before going ahead and bringing it. Rav Tarfon in that Mishnah says no. He says that even though I brought it on uncertainty, even though I didn't have knowledge, I still might, and I brought the carbon only on a possibility. That carbon on the possibility covers even when I find out later on that I did it on purpose. Even when I find out that I actually did it, later on I'm like, oh yeah, I actually did, do this crime. That carbon that was brought, even though there was no yediyah, even though there was no knowledge, that carbon would suffice and cover that mistake. Right? With me?
Yeah, it seems like the whole point of it, though, that would cover it. I mean, if you're bringing a carbon because you possibly did something, you kind of did something, that possibly doing something kind of, wouldn't that automatically cover you doing something?
Well, it's interesting. They say, there's an interesting, observation made by many about like this whole idea of asham talui. They say that, the reason that you have to bring this is because a person could, there is this idea that a person, if I don't know I did it, then maybe I'll just like, okay, it's a pass. Like, okay, whatever. I'm not sure if I did it. It's not like such a big deal. To that we say no. Like it's even in some ways it's even worse. Like then I don't take it as seriously because I may not have done it. So I have to go ahead and bring this carbon in that scenario. So one could understand there's a qualitative difference between I'm not sure if I did it and the carbon I bring for that, or the carbon I bring for I know I did this, right? So there is a qualitative difference. But you're right. The reason I'm bringing it is because of my uncertainty. But at the same time, the carbon that I'm bringing is qualitatively different than a scenario where I know I did something wrong, right? And therefore, right, we could see a difference. But the main point that comes out of this is Rav Tarfon saying, even though I brought the carbon without a yediyah, without a full-fledged knowledge, the carbon suffices. So you see, according to Rav Tarfon, he minimizes the concept of knowledge before bringing a carbon asham. That's the main point that we're trying to bring out of here. So far so good before we even start the Gemara, but that's the basic point. Now Rav Tarfon says, even though I brought an asham talui, a maybe asham, and there was no yediyah before I brought this carbon, there's no knowledge I did something wrong before bringing the carbon, that yediyah, that knowledge is not important. So we see Rav Tarfon minimizes the value of knowledge, and we'll see how that plays a role for other halachos. So Amrullah, so now let's see this inside. According to the one, meaning Rav Tarfon, who holds that a definite asham does not require prior awareness, prior knowledge. Okay, let's turn the page now at Ayin Beis Amud Aleph 72. Ba'al chamesh bi'ilos b'shivcha charufa in a scenario where a person goes ahead and they cohabit with this betrothed slave woman, right? So she is designated, she is like engaged, halachically engaged to a Jewish man. And but again, it's not a full-fledged marriage. But she's engaged to this Jewish man, a Jewish slave, and then another individual goes ahead and cohabits with her 5 times. In between each time, by mistake, in other words, whatever the mistake is, but in between each time, there is knowledge of what he did. Okay, so there is knowledge each time. Now, typically, when there's knowledge each time, let's say by karban chatas, what did we say earlier? We said like this: if a person goes ahead and eats a piece of chelev, and then he knows that he ate chelev, and then he eats chelev again, and he knows he ate chelev, everyone agrees you have to bring how many karbanos? 2. Very good, right? So you have to bring 2 because there's a knowledge, right? There's the sense that I did something wrong and I know about it. If I did it all within one knowledge, in other words, in one lapse, I only bring 1. Over here, interestingly, a person did 5 crimes, each time a mistake. Each time is a mistake. And each time the person did the sin, and then the person knows about it. The person did the sin, they know about it. The person did the sin, they know about it. So you would think you have to bring 5 different sin offerings, right? 5 different ashams. But since Rav Tarfon holds that Yediyah, knowledge, is not so significant by an asham, therefore, the Gemara concludes, Ula concludes, that Eino Chayv La'achas. The knowledge in between each one is not enough to trigger a new karban for each one, and rather the person, when at the end of this whole story, the person only ends up bringing 1 karban for all of them, because knowledge is not so significant when it comes to an asham. That's what comes out of Rav Tarfon's view. Yeah? In other words, normally knowledge by a chatas, knowledge is enough to trigger its own karban. But over here, we're seeing that Rav Tarfon told us that that a person brought a karban even without knowledge. That works. What do you see? You see that knowledge is not so significant. An awareness is not so significant. Therefore, here too, where a person did something wrong, and then they became aware of it, did something wrong, became aware of it, did something wrong, became aware of it, those awarenesses are not significant enough to trigger their own independent karbanos, and a person can bring 1 karban and cover all of those sins.
It's not really the same act, though. If you're doing it and becoming aware of it, it's not the same act as if you're just doing it.
That's true, but in other words, let's say a scenario where a person did 5 actions and then found out only once at the end. By chatas, let's say a person ate 5 pieces of chelev, even though those actions are separate, but since there's only 1 awareness, we say everyone agrees you only bring 1 karban in that case. So here we're saying it's 5 actions, there is awareness in between, but awareness in between by asham clearly is not so significant according to this individual. Okay? So Maskeva Rav Hanuna. Rav Hanuna asked the following case, and we'll see he's asking in a bit of a sharp and somewhat cynical fashion. He says, Elamiyat, according to what you're saying, Baal v'chazar uval v'hifresh karban. Let's say a person goes ahead and a bunch of times he cohabits with this betrothed slave woman. V'amar hamtinu li'at she'evel. And then after he separates the karban, he says, hold on, I'm going to go back and be a cohabit with this woman. Right? And obviously it's not literal, but the point is that we're saying, he said, you want to tell me in a case where even the guy goes ahead and separates a karban, he separates an animal, designates it for a karban, there too, you want to tell me that he doesn't have to bring an additional karban for the prior be'ilos? Again, the scenario is the guy who goes ahead and cohabits with a woman, this slave woman, and then he separates an animal to bring as a karban, and then he cohabits with her again. You want to tell me, based on your reasoning, that the karban that he separated already is going to, cover the additional actions of cohabitation? That doesn't make sense. So Amrle Ula responds, "Ma'is la'achar frasha amras, ma'is la'achar frasha lo kamina." He says, "What? You're not making a good comparison." He said, I'm speaking about yediyah. I'm speaking about just awareness. You're talking about where you actually go ahead and separate the animal for a karban. You're right. He says there's a difference. In a scenario, the person cohabits and becomes aware. Cohabits and becomes aware. We say 1 karban covers all of them because the awareness by an asham is not significant. But in a case where a person cohabits, becomes aware, separates an animal for a karban, and then cohabits, becomes aware, there you don't say the original karban that you designated is going to cover it. Those things are not comparable, right? Comparable, right? Those things are separate, those things are different, and therefore he's saying your question is not a question. Okay, now the Gemara comes and says another statement about this betrothed slave woman. Ki asr Dimi Amar, Lamada Amar Asham Vade Bayadiyah Batchila, according to Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva was the one who said that a person does need to have Yediyah. Right? According to Rabbi Akiva, if a person goes ahead and brings an asham talui, right? They go ahead and commit some crime that obligates an asham offering, but they're not sure if they did that crime or not. So they bring this asham talui. They bring this asham which they say, if I committed this crime, this karban will cover it. And then afterwards, they have a yediyah. Afterwards, they become aware that they did actually commit that crime. According to Rabbi Akiva, I am obligated to bring an additional karban. So clearly, according to Rabbi Akiva, yediyah, awareness, does trigger, according to that opinion, Baal chamisha be'ilos b'shivcha charufa chayv al kol achas v'achas. In a scenario where a person goes ahead and cohabits, again, by mistake, 5 times with a betrothed slave woman, and in between each time there is awareness, then he's going to be chayav for each one. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, he holds Yediyah, awareness, is significant. Right? And so far we've been working within Rav Tarfon, who holds that awareness is insignificant. And therefore we said, even though the person became aware in between each one, it doesn't matter. But now we're saying, according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that awareness is significant, if a person goes ahead and cohabits with a slave woman and then becomes aware, cohabits with a slave woman, becomes aware, for each awareness and each act in awareness, there'd be a separate asham that the person would be obligated to bring. Okay, Amalei Abaye. Abaye questions this. He says, "Harichatas debeinan yediyah betchila ufligi Rav Yochanan Rav Shimon Lakish." He says, "I don't understand." He says, by a korban chatas, where everyone agrees, everyone agrees that you need to have yediyah, you need to have awareness in order for the korban to be effective. And yet, we saw Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagreed about that case. That was yesterday's Gemara. We had Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish arguing in the case where you have by a korban chatas, everyone agrees you need to have prior awareness in order to be obligated to bring the korban. Right? Without yediyah, if a person goes in and brings a korban without yediyah, it's meaningless. You need to know and then bring the korban. And yet, in that case, Rish Lakish and Rav Yochanan argue about whether or not one korban suffices or not. So why are you telling me over here that everyone would agree by the Asham Vadai that according to Rabbi Akiva, everyone would agree that once you have Yediyah in between each thing, you have to bring 5 korbanos. It should be Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish should disagree in that case. Okay, so let's turn the page. If you're in the article, let's turn the page. Ishtik, he was quiet, didn't have a good answer. So Amar Leah, Abaye says to Rav Dimi, okay, he says, Dilma b'maisa la'achar frasha ka'amra skurav amnuna. Maybe what you meant to say was not the scenario where the person just simply had Yediyah. Maybe what you meant to say was the person goes ahead and commits this crime by mistake, and then they separate an animal for a korban, right? And then they commit the crime again. There, everyone agrees that both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish would agree that you would have to bring a new korban since you separated a korban already for the first action. Yes, says Rav Dimi, that's what I meant to say. I didn't just mean Yediyah, I meant Hafrasha, I meant designating the animal. That's what I meant to say. Okay, now we're going to have a concluding comment about this case of Shifcha Charufa, and we will call it a day. Okay? Ki Asar Ravin Amar. When Ravin came to Eretz Yisrael, he said the following: Hakol modim b'shifcha charufa. Okay, he says there is a case by the betrothed woman that everyone, meaning Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish, agree. And there's a case by the betrothed woman that both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree. And there's a machlokes, there's a debate by the Shifcha Charufa. Okay, so he doesn't tell us what this means. We're going to unpack it right now. But he basically tells us that there's 2 cases by the Shifcha Charufa that both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree about, and there's 1 case that they disagree about. Okay, what are those? Hakomo de Shifcha Charufa deina chayav ala achas. Okay, that both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree to the statement of Ula. Ula was the first statement, who said that according to Rav Tarfon, again, so this is going to be a good summary of our last Amud. Both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree. Again, Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagreed by the case of the Chatas, where there's knowledge, how significant that knowledge is. Okay, but they both agree that within the world of Rav Tarfon, who said that by the Asham, your Yediyah is not significant. Okay, they both agree that to what Ula said, that a scenario where a person went ahead and cohabited with the slave woman, and then had awareness of it. Cohabited with the slave woman, had awareness of it. Even though Rav Yochanan normally says awareness is enough to obligate additional individual karbanos, over here by the Asham, Yediyah is not so significant, and therefore even Rav Yochanan would agree that 1 korban would suffice. Okay, so again, let's just pause for a second, and we'll do a full review, even from what we saw yesterday. Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish had a debate about, let's say a person commits a chatas sin, a sin that would obligate a chatas, and then became aware of it, okay? And then they committed the same sin and became aware of it. We had a machlokas between Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish as to how many karbanos you bring in that case. Rish Lakish said 1 karban. Rav Yochanan said, no, once I had a yediyah, once I had awareness, that obligates 1 karban, and then when I do it again, I'd have to bring a 2nd karban, right? That was the debate we had then. Asham, it seems, is lesser. Yediyah by an Asham is not going to have the same significance. At least we have a debate by an Asham, and therefore Rav Tarfon is able to hold, Rav Tarfon Zatana, he holds that Yediyah, that awareness by an Asham, does not trigger its own thing. And Rav Yochanan would agree to that. Everyone would agree. Rav Yochanan would not be more stringent. He would say, yeah, Rav Tarfon has this view, but it's unique to an Asham. By an Asham, Yediyah is not significant enough to obligate its own korban. Okay? That's one thing they agree about. And both Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree that there would be separate liability for two violations. What's that referring to? What that's referring to is the case we just saw. That even Rish Lakish, who normally holds that you're only going to be obligated for one carbon for a number of acts, if I went ahead, a person goes ahead and commits a crime and then separates an animal, designates it for a carbon, and then commits the crime again, even Rish Lakish would agree that in that case, you'd have to bring a second carbon. Okay, so therefore, even Rish Lakish, who normally holds that one carbon suffices for a bunch of acts, if I separate a carbon, even by an asham, then one carbon is not enough. I'd have to go, if I separate a carbon and then I commit the same act again, that carbon that I separated prior does not cover both those cases. Okay? And then, umachlokas b'shivcha charufa. What's the case in machlokas? Lemanda amar asham vadei ba yedi batchila. Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Rav Shimon ben Lakish. According to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that a person has to have definite knowledge. Meaning, according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that if a person brings a asham talui, a person goes ahead and commits a crime that obligates an asham, but they're not sure if they did it, and they bring the maybe asham. Right? So Rabbi Akiva says in that case, if I therefore find out later on that I did it deliberately, do I have to bring a carbon or not? Another carbon? Rabbi Akiva says, yes, I do have to bring another carbon. Okay, so according to that opinion of Rabbi Akiva, let's say the person goes ahead and cohabits with a shivcha charufa, and then becomes knowledgeable of it, and then cohabits with a shivcha charufa, becomes knowledgeable about it. According to Rabbi Akiva, that's where we would have machlokas Rav Yochanan, Rish Lakish. Rav Yochanan would say, I'd have to bring a separate carbon for each case, whereas Rish Lakish would say, no, just like a chatas, even though I had yediyah, knowledge in between, it's not strong enough to obligate me to bring a carbon for each one, and one yediyah at the end would be, and I would just bring one carbon at the end for all of those actions. Okay? So, yeah, go ahead.
So it's only under Rabbi Akiva's opinion that we have machlokas, is what we're saying.
Correct. All right, everyone agree with Rav Tarfon. Exactly. Good way of summarizing it. Okay, we're going to start a new Gemara, fresh Gemara. Tomorrow, I will see you then. Let's learn a little Rav Dessler, right? Because we have some time. Okay, so then we'll finish on a. Okay, so Rav Dessler, we've been speaking about this piece of giving and taking, a very long piece. We're not going to finish it all in one shot. But he's speaking about, let's just summarize the last piece that he said. He spoke about the fact that at the core, every human being is either a giver or a taker. Okay? And he goes on to say, or maybe I'm going to elaborate a little bit on a point he makes, and that is that you can have two people who seem like they're doing the same thing. They're both acting kind to someone else. Okay? Like the example, an example, I don't know, it's their friend's birthday. So two people are both giving a birthday cake to their friend. Externally, they look exactly the same. They're both giving to their friend. One person is giving because they say, I love this person. I want them to know how valuable they are, how much I care about them, how special they are, and I want to make sure that people that the person knows how much I care about them. Here's a birthday cake, right? The other person is giving the birthday cake and thinking to themselves, my birthday's in 2 months from now. I want to get a birthday cake myself. I want to have the acknowledgement myself, right? They're both doing the external act, but one of them at the core is a giver and one of them at the core is a taker. Externally, they look the same, right? But the flip side is also true. The flip side is true in the sense you could have two people who are both takers, both taking, but at the core, one is the giver, one is the taker. What does that look like? So he quotes the medrash that says, Rashi quotes this, that, Rashi does not quote this, but the medrash that says that Chanoch walked with Hashem. Chanoch is 7 generations from Adam, and we have this quick lineage of generation, and then it says Chanoch walked with Hashem. What does it mean, Chanoch walked with Hashem? The medrash says something very interesting, that Chanoch was a cobbler. He used to make shoes, stitch shoes, and when he would stitch shoes, he would be making these unions between heaven and earth, between Hashem and the world. So Rav Yisrael Slanter asked, what does that mean? He was thinking about these mystical ideas when he was making shoes? He says, that's usher, right? If you have a job, if you're working for someone's paying you to make their shoes, and you're listening to shir, that's actually forbidden, right? It's not such a holy thing. It's forbidden because you're not focusing on your job well enough, right? If I have to think, oh wait, Rav Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Asham Talei, whoa, I'm going to be distracted from what I'm doing. So he says, that can't be pshat. Pshat must be that we're talking about someone who is actually, he says, what the meaning of it, says Rav Yisrael Slanter, is the person is actually completely focused on their friend, on the person they're making shoes for. That is called making a union with Hashem. Why? If you remember, we started off with that the most godly thing we could do, the most prime attribute we know of Hashem is that He is a nosein. Tov umetiv, the thing we know about Hashem more than anything else, the core identity of Hashem to us is that Hashem gives. That's why He created the world. From our perspective, He wanted to give to us. So when a person goes ahead and makes these shoes, does their job, whatever their job is, fill in the blank, and they're doing it totally focused on their friends, that is called connecting heaven and earth. That's called making yichudim, the most lofty type of connection to Hashem. I want this person to get the best product in the world. I want this person to have the best shoes. I want this person to have the best service. I want this person, I'm completely focused on them. That is the most godly thing we could do. the most godly thing we do, that person's a giver, right? So you have the two people making shoes, and one of them is focused on themselves, or they're even focused on God. They're still a taker, because then when they get paid, it's not about the other person; it's about themselves. When they take, we have to take. We live in a world of give and take. We have to take. But at the core, are they a giver or taker? That person, whether they're focusing on the fact that they're going to get paid at the end, or they're focusing even on, I'm distracted by the share I want to listen to, that person's a taker. Whereas the person who is totally focused on the person they are servicing, and they want to make sure that person's getting the best service possible, the best product possible, that person at the core is a giver, and that's what we are striving to do. And the rest of the piece is going to lay out for us how to become a giving type of person, because we might be stuck. Some of us are more innately towards giving, some of us more innately towards taking, but that doesn't mean we cannot change it, and that's what he's going to continue on the rest of the piece, how we're able to shift and change and transform ourselves to become more godly, more giving like, as opposed to more of a taker. Okay, have a great day.